stolen and shipped like cargo. He was 7 years old, shoeless, dressed in a threadbare jumper that barely clung to his shoulders, curled into himself on the deck of a rust-slicked cargo ship. Salt wind stung his face. His small hands gripped a splintered wooden rail as the coastline of England faded into the fog. He wasn't sure where he was going, only that his mother hadn't come to say goodbye. No one had. Around him, dozens of other children, many even younger, huddled together, their eyes red from crying, their lips cracked from the cold sea air. A few had scraps of paper sewn into their jackets, with names and dates scrawled in pencil, like fragile parcels, headed to the other side of the world. This is not the start of a fictional tragedy. This was Operation Child Migration. From the late 19th century until as recently as 1970, more than 130,000 British children were forcibly shipped overseas to Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and what was then southern Rhodesia. They were told they were orphans, that they were unwanted, that across the seas sunshine and opportunity awaited. But those were lies. Many of these children had living parents, parents who were struggling, yes, but who had never consented to their children's exile. With the blessing of the British government and under the moral authority of the Church, these children were uprooted from orphanages, foster homes, and even their own family living rooms. They were loaded onto ships and sent thousands of miles away, often never to return. Why? Because it was cheaper. Because white settler nations wanted to populate their territories, preferably with white British stock. The children were seen as pliable labor, easy to control, easy to train, and easy to forget. In the official language of the time, they were called juvenile migrants. In practice, they were treated like cargo. Institutional silence covered their cries. Government archives buried the paperwork in red tape. Meanwhile, churches and charities signed off on the transports, all in the name of salvation, civilization, and discipline. But once the ships docked in places like Fremantle or Brisbane, the real nightmare began. Children were placed in remote farming complexes, religious settlements, or with complete strangers, some cruel, some criminal. Physical abuse was routine, emotional trauma was constant, and in many institutions, sexual abuse ran rampant, unchecked, for decades. And so we ask, how did thousands of British children disappear across oceans, with the approval of church and state, while an entire society looked the other way? Who benefited? Who knew? And what happened to the children who were promised utopia but arrived in hell? This is the dark history of Britain's forgotten children, and the scars they were forced to carry, across continents, across lifetimes. Post-war poverty and the Empire's hidden agenda, London, 1918. The Great War had ended, but the Empire was bleeding, quietly. In the grey chill of post-war Britain, victory did little to warm the hearts or fill the stomachs of the working class. Ragged children huddled in alleyways, soot mixing with fog as chimneys belched their endless smoke. Bread lines grew longer. Bomb scars streaked across both brick and psyche. Hundreds of thousands of men returned from the front lines, only to find jobs gone, homes decayed, and the promise of prosperity shattered beneath state indifference. This was not the Britain the war heroes had been promised. And yet, in the smoking ruins of post-war austerity, something older and far more sinister was already taking form. Beneath its fractured class system and flickering gas lamps, a new kind of campaign had begun, one rooted not in liberation, but in control. The British Empire, though fractured, still stretched across continents. but its grasp was faltering. Independence movements simmered from India to Africa. The colonies, once the jewels in the crown, were slipping away, and with them went the cheap labor that had powered industries and settlements overseas. Britain needed workers, young ones, trainable, obedient, disposable. And so, behind closed doors of government offices and charitable institutions, a dark solution emerged: child migration. Ostensibly charitable, cloaked in words like rescue and opportunity, these policies were anything but. They were meticulously engineered to export Britain's poorest, its unwanted, under the illusion of salvation. Between the 1920s and 1970s, thousands of children, many from working-class families, orphanages, or single-parent households, were sent away to Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and what remained of the empire. They were told they'd find homes, education, maybe even fortune. What most found was hunger, isolation, abuse. This silence didn't happen by accident. It was carefully curated by a British elite that viewed poverty almost as a contagion. At the time, social welfare was minimal, and institutions like Barnardo's and the Church of England were seen less as safety nets and more as moral reformatories. Children born out of wedlock, children of the poor, and children who simply didn't fit were marked, not with ink, but with abandonment. They were labeled feeble-minded, delinquent, maladjusted. In reality, they were simply born into the wrong postcode. To those in power, these children were raw material, suitable for empire building. Australia, in particular, beckoned. Populate or perish, the politicians warned. Vast stretches of rural land needed white hands to till it, white minds to inhabit it. White being the operative word, in a dominion fixated on maintaining its racial purity. British children, even the poorest among them, could serve as both settlers and symbols. They wouldn't just grow crops or clean toilets, they would grow the empire itself. And so, the hidden agenda became policy. Government files, long buried, later revealed casual conversations about clearing out the slums and relieving the burden of welfare. Officials spoke in code, emigration relief and domicile upgrades, but their meaning was simple. These children were not wanted here, and if they could be useful elsewhere, their bodies could be shipped accordingly. Unsurprisingly, informed consent rarely entered the equation. Children as young as 3 were separated from siblings, told their parents were dead even when they weren't. Mothers, often struggling with poverty or illness, were pressured to sign forms they couldn't read. Others never even knew their child had been taken. What tied it all together wasn't just desperation, it was ideology. Imperial Britain believed in its own supremacy, a racist, classist conviction that civilization required hierarchy. Those at the bottom would always be useful, somewhere, and children, innocent and voiceless, became the blank canvases onto which this dying empire painted its final, desperate strokes. The truth was smothered in silence for decades, but behind every official stamp and lofty phrase like a better life, there lay a simple, devastating truth. Britain had found a way to turn poverty into policy, classism into export, and children into cargo. Empire's orphans, manufacturing, and underclass, they were called orphans. That word, simple and sorrowful, carried with it the weight of pity, of assumed tragedy. To the public, they were motherless, fatherless, abandoned by fate and saved by empire. In official records, governments labeled them as waifs, foundlings, or destitute children. But behind those cold classifications lay something far more complex and far more disturbing. Because many of these children, shipped across oceans from Britain to Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and beyond as part of child migration schemes, were not truly orphaned at all. They had mothers, fathers, families, people who loved them, people who wanted them. But the state had decided otherwise. From the late 19th century through much of the 20th, Britain instituted policies that resulted in over 130,000 children being sent overseas, often under the guise of offering them a better life, an empire-building operation cloaked in altruism. But the machinery behind that operation was fueled by class prejudice, social control, and a ruthless appetite for labor. It began in the smoky underbellies of industrial cities, London, Glasgow, Liverpool, where poverty clung to narrow alleyways like soot to brickwork. For a single working-class mother, life was a tightrope over an abyss. One missed rent payment, one illness, one day of lost wages. That's all it took for her to catch the eye of local authorities. Charity boards, social workers, and government institutions that bore all the language of care, but operated more like surveillance arms of the state. With the rise of late Victorian moral reform movements, poverty itself became suspect. To be poor was no longer simply unfortunate. It was, increasingly, seen as immoral. Social purity campaigners and eugenic theorists whispered through parlors and pulpits that certain people, usually working-class women, should never have become mothers to begin with. And so the system found a convenient fiction. By labeling these children as orphans, the state erased mothers without having to bury them. Sometimes it happened through coercion, poverty forcing a desperate woman to leave her child in a workhouse, hoping for food or shelter, only for that child to be quietly reclassified as ward of the state. Other times, it was outright fraud. As historian Margaret Humphreys uncovered in her groundbreaking investigation, government records were deliberately forged. Parents were told their children had been adopted locally. Children were told their parents had died, and in many cases, those parents were still alive, still searching. Take the story of Mary, a young mother in Manchester in the 1930s. Struggling after her husband died in a mining accident, she placed her two boys temporarily in the care of local authorities while she sought work. When she returned, she was told they were doing well on a farm. What she wasn't told? That farm was in Western Australia. The boys had been shipped out weeks earlier without her knowledge. She never saw them again. Mary's story wasn't unique. It was systemic. Motherhood among the poor became conditional. Respectable if you had money. Criminal if you didn't. Welfare institutions like the Poor Law Boards and children's charities such as Barnardo's or the Child Migrants Trust developed a paternalistic confidence that they knew best. That working-class women could not be trusted to raise their own children. These weren't heartless bureaucrats entirely. They believed, in many cases, that they were doing good. That children growing up in Britain's slums would have better lives with fresh air and opportunity abroad. But the morality of salvation cannot wash away the fundamental violation. Mothers were stripped of their children, often by force, and those children were told a lie about who they were. This was not charity. It was social engineering. The exported children, once abroad, became part of a new underclass. Cheap labor for colonial farms, homes, and institutions. Boys for the fields. Girls for domestic service. Some ended up in remote orphanages run by religious organizations, places where cruelty masqueraded as discipline, and forgiveness came only in hymns muffled by fear. Abuse was rampant. And for these children, told they came from nothing, there was no way home. No memory to anchor them, no letters allowed, no photographs. The empire had taken their past, and with it, their right to ever ask why. Today we know the names of some of those children. A few have reclaimed their stories, but the full scale of this betrayal, of poor mothers deemed disposable, of families ripped apart under the flag of imperial virtue, remains only partially uncovered. They weren't orphans. They were made orphans. By institutions that weaponized poverty. By a society that judged a mother's love by the contents of her purse. And by an empire that needed labor more than it needed truth. The church's hand in the trade. It began with hymns, gentle, lilting lullabies echoing through cold stone walls. Psalms meant to soothe, to comfort. In the cavernous halls of church-run orphanages across Britain, sacred verses intertwined with the cries of children who had no mothers or fathers, only priests, nuns, and the church itself. For many of Britain's most vulnerable, faith was not just a spiritual promise. It was the institution that clothed them, fed them, and ultimately decided their fate. From the mid-19th century and well into the 20th, the Church, especially the Church of England and the Roman Catholic Church, played a pivotal role in the management of orphanages and child welfare programs. But within this cloak of piety, charitable righteousness, and divine mission, something far more sinister was at work. Many of these religious bodies were not simply caretakers. They were gatekeepers of mass child relocation programs that would see over 100,000 British children exported to colonies like Australia and Canada under what was later dubbed the Child Migrant Scheme. These children were told they'd find bright futures overseas, homes with loving families, work opportunities, warm beds. That was the heavenly story. The hellish truth was something else entirely. Churches mobilized these programs under the guise of salvation. They described it as rescuing neglected or impoverished children, removing them from moral decay, and placing them into good Christian homes. Officially, it was a noble mission, to offer poor kids a second chance at life, one infused with purpose, discipline, and religious guidance. But in reality, the children sent abroad were often far from orphaned. Many had living parents or relatives who, often under pressure or without full knowledge, surrendered them to institutions promised to care for them. And those institutions, many under the direct management of churches, became silent cogs in a vast machinery of systematic abuse. Take the case of Bindoon, a Catholic-run institution in Western Australia operated by the Christian Brothers. Children who arrived there were put to work in slave-like conditions, building the very structures that imprisoned them. Brutal beatings, sexual abuse, starvation, and isolation were common. And yet, across the seas in Britain, glossy reports painted these missions as blessed sanctuaries where the gospel was alive and flourishing. The Church of England, too, was not merely a passive observer. Anglican charities like the Waifs and Strays Society, now the Children's Society, were actively involved in both domestic and international relocation schemes. Parishes often sponsored entire efforts, raising funds through Sunday donations and preaching tales of redemption to their congregations. All the while, complaints from children overseas of violence, neglect, and horrendous living conditions were either ignored, silenced, or called exaggerated. Inquiries much later would reveal that church officials were often aware, or at least willfully blind. Records were conveniently lost, reports went unanswered, and clergy who perpetrated abuse were transferred, not tried. Silence was not just a byproduct, it was policy. For decades, these religious institutions held incredible power. They were beyond question. To speak against the church was to risk your soul as well as your reputation. Survivors who did make it back to Britain often found no sanctuary in speaking out. Many were labeled delusional, others traumatized beyond words. Their testimonies, of rectors who beat them with belts, of nuns who locked them in dark rooms for days, of priests who committed unspeakable acts behind altar doors, were filed away, as if their pain could be archived too. What allowed this complicity to fester wasn't just institutional protection, it was ideology. The bedrock of moral superiority, an idea that the church alone could determine right and wrong, salvation from sin. These children were seen not as individuals with rights or voices, but as lost souls. Their suffering, a necessary trial before salvation. Their abuse, denied, dismissed, or described as a form of righteous discipline. To question it was to question God's divine plan. By the latter half of the 20th century, scandals began to slowly emerge. Whispered stories turned into loud outcries. Investigative journalists and relentless survivors began piecing together the enormity of what had happened. The Truth, Justice and Healing Council in Australia, the Northern Ireland Historical Institutional Abuse Inquiry, and Britain's own independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, each revealed horrifying patterns of systemic abuse, and the Church's key roles in allowing it to continue. We now know that thousands of children suffered, not despite the religious institutions overseeing them, but because of them. The pulpits that thundered about Christian love and divine mercy were the same that ushered children into abusive exile. Sermons rang out across the United Kingdom, promising deliverance, while across the globe, small hands bled under labor, and small voices cried out where no one listened. This was not a failure of faith, it was a failure of power. And beneath the stained glass windows and gold-framed portraits of saints, another silent gospel was being written. One of complicity and betrayal, ships of shame. The journey to no return. They were packed into ships, hundreds at a time, small hands gripping wooden railings, eyes wide with fear as the familiar coastline of Britain dissolved into the morning mist. For most of them, it would be the last time they ever saw home. Between the late 19th century and well into the 1970s, more than 130,000 children were shipped from Britain to far-flung corners of the empire, including Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and what was then Southern Rhodesia, under government-sponsored child migration programs. Officially, it was a mission to offer a better life, but in practice, it was a mass deportation of society's most vulnerable. Many were not orphans at all. They had families who, more often than not, had no idea their children were being sent across the sea. The journey itself was the prelude to the trauma. Once they were loaded onto the massive gray freighters and passenger liners, the children were crammed into below-decks quarters, institutional, cold, and under-policed. Conditions resembled more a troop transport than a vessel of mercy. Shipping manifests tell part of the story. In 1947, the Ormond and Empire Brent carried hundreds of children from Tilbury Docks in London to Fremantle, Australia. Survivors recall being handed cardboard tags around their necks, labeled with nothing more than a number and a destination, not unlike parcels. "We weren't people," said former child migrant David Hill in a 2009 interview. "We were cargo. Nobody cared about us. Not really." The journey could take weeks, depending on weather and the route. For a 7-year-old, torn from everything familiar, language, climate, customs, even the cadence of voices, the sea journey was a surreal, liminal space. Some were sick the entire voyage. Others cried themselves to sleep to the shudders of the diesel engines. There was no parental hand to hold. No explanations, no comfort. The psychological dislocation was immediate and profound. Many children had been told they were going on a holiday, or worse, that their parents had died. In reality, some parents had only temporarily given their children over to the care system, often under duress or financial hardship. Their consent was rarely informed and almost never honored. Once the children reached their destinations, the trauma only deepened. In Australia, children were funneled into isolated institutions with names that now carry a chilling weight. Bindoon, Fairbridge, Nazareth House. These were not homes in any warm sense of the word. They were often brutal, underfunded, and managed by religious orders or state facilities with little oversight. I remember stepping off the ship and seeing the red dust swirling in the air, said Margaret Humphreys, one of the social workers who later uncovered the scale of the program. The children had never seen anything like it. They were bewildered, terrified. Many arrival ports, like Fremantle or Halifax, became the ominous gateways to lives of enforced labor and abuse. In Canada, children were placed with farming families, often serving as cheap labor with little to no schooling. In Australia, manual work on farms or building sites was common, beginning in childhood and continuing through adolescence. Physical and sexual abuse was endemic. Complaints often disappeared into silence. The institutions were deliberately remote. Bindoon, run by the Christian Brothers in Western Australia, stood like a fortress amid desolate scrubland. Survivors described days filled with grueling labor, laying bricks, hauling heavy loads under the punishing sun, all while enduring beatings for the smallest infraction. It was the loneliest place on earth, said John Hennessy, who arrived in Australia at age 10. I remember waiting every day for a letter that never came. I didn't know my mother was alive. I thought she'd died. That's what they told me on the ship, and that's what haunts the stories of these ships of shame. The enduring lie. That they were unwanted. That no one cared. That their passage to the other side of the world was a rescue, not a theft. The voyage itself became a border between two lives, one of memory and the other of silence. The children who boarded those ships were never seen again, not as the people they had been. They arrived in alien lands, with their names misspelled, their birthdays guessed, and their histories erased. Decades later, when some finally pieced together their pasts, they found birth certificates tucked away in dusty British archives. They found mothers who had searched for them for years, unaware they'd been sent halfway across the world. The ships bore names meant to inspire, the Zealandia, the Asturias, the Empire Orwell. But for thousands, their hulls carried sorrow, and every wave crashed not only against the bow, but against the lives that would be forever broken by the journey. What began as a voyage across oceans ended as a severance from truth, from identity, from love. A journey to no return, aboard the ships of shame. Scars of the red earth, labor, whippings, and forgotten lives. Half a world away from the soot-stained streets of post-war Britain, beneath the blistering sun of the Australian outback, children toiled in silence, on land red as rust, under skies that offered no shelter. This was not the land of golden opportunity they had been promised. For the thousands of child migrants sent from Britain to Australia during the 20th century, life on remote Catholic-run institutions like Bindoon was a cycle of unpaid labor, unbroken violence, and a loneliness so deep it could hollow out a soul. Bindoon, a name that once brought fear to the lips of children as young as 7. Officially called the Bindoon Boys' Town and operated by the Congregation of Christian Brothers, this institution in Western Australia was supposed to be a place of care, of education, of moral uplift. But behind its stone facades, many of them built by the hands of the very children it imprisoned, was a harsher truth. Children were worked until their muscles quaked and their innocence was broken. The daily routine was brutal. Boys labored under the sun from dawn to dusk, hauling stones, mixing concrete by hand, building roads, and erecting the very buildings they were confined in, without pay and with little consideration for their age or physical development. Diaries and inquiry reports describe how food was scarce, rooms unheated, hygiene minimal. Education was an afterthought, minimal and erratic at best. One survivor, Norman Johnston, recounted in a 1998 interview for Australia's Senate inquiry how at age 12 he was put to work dragging 50-pound stone blocks without boots, often cutting his feet open on shards of limestone. "They worked us like animals," he said. "Only animals get treated better." Behind closed doors, violence was institutionalized. Discipline was often delivered through beatings, fists, leather straps, even iron rods. According to the Lost Innocence report published by the Australian government in 2001, physical punishment at institutions like Bindoon was not just tolerated, but encouraged. One child might be whipped until he bled through his shirt for something as trivial as speaking out of turn or failing to complete a task on time. Another might be locked in isolation for days, fed only water and bread. The Christian Brothers, figures of power and religious moralism, were often the perpetrators. Survivors speak of being forced to kneel in gravel for hours, of being paraded naked and humiliated in front of other children. That cruelty was not accidental. It was calculated. Designed to break the spirit, erase identity, and replace it with absolute obedience. But the most damning scars were not always visible. A darker plague haunted these institutions: sexual abuse, widespread and unchecked. Children, left without protection and thousands of miles from family, were easy prey for predators in robes. The Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse, in its final 2017 report, confirmed what survivors had been testifying for decades: that sexual abuse in institutions like Bindoon was endemic. Testimonies described children being dragged from their bunks in the dead of night, of being silenced with threats, or punished brutally when they tried to resist. In many cases, the abuse was ritualized, passed down from one abuser to another, covered up by a system more committed to preserving its reputation than protecting children. Some boys were abused for years and told that speaking out would bring damnation or deportation. One of the most gut-wrenching testimonies came from a man named Jerry, who arrived in Australia at the age of 10. He spoke of a brother who repeatedly abused him, bending religious teachings to justify his crimes. He told me that Jesus would want me to be clean, that my sin was in resisting him. The weight of that manipulation, delivered under the guise of sacred authority, marked Jerry for life. Emotional isolation compounded the physical and sexual trauma. Letters home were intercepted or never sent. Children were told that their parents had died or simply abandoned them. For many, this was a carefully manufactured lie. Some families back in Britain were trying to locate their children, denied access by bureaucracies and religious orders. Other migrants were orphans in name only. They were sons and daughters of impoverished families who had been misled into believing that their children were bound for a better future. Instead, they were sent to institutions that erased their names, their histories, and their futures. A generation of children grew up under the false sun of a colonial promise, isolated not just by distance, but by the walls of silence, fear, and abuse that surrounded them. The system was vast, But the stories are painfully individual. Boys like Norman, Jerry, and thousands of others were robbed of childhood, of trust, of the simple right to be safe. And as the red earth of Australia holds the bones of old colonizers and native ancestors, it also bears the weight of these forgotten children, whose labor built the walls of Bindoon, whose screams once echoed through its stone halls, and whose truths were buried for decades beneath layers of denial and shame. These were not mere cases of negligence. They were not isolated incidents. As confirmed by 5 separate Australian government inquiries, including the 2001 Senate report and the 2017 Royal Commission, this was systemic abuse, calculated, institutionalized, and carried out in the name of charity. We remember this now not only to mourn the past, but to demand never again. Secrecy and silence. The system that burned the records. It begins with a name, then takes it away. In Britain's bleak network of mid-20th century children's homes, secrecy wasn't just a symptom. It was the system itself. Identities were scrubbed, files vanished into locked cabinets or incinerators, and the children left behind were ghosts with paper-thin pasts. For decades, the machinery of the state and its contracted institutions operated under a chilling creed. Conceal everything, confess nothing. There are stories of children who, at the age of 4 or 5, were shipped to orphanages without birth certificates, no family photos, no mementos, not even the knowledge of their own last names. In some cases, even their birthdays were changed. Records were either never made or deliberately altered, quietly suggesting the child had always been under the institution's care. A phantom history that made it impossible for them to piece together who they were or where they'd come from. This systematic erasure didn't happen by accident. As uncovered in the 1998 Ford inquiry, a damning investigation into abuse and neglect at Queensland institutions for boys, many of the institutions that governed the lives of these children adopted a policy of minimizing record-keeping. Paper trails weren't just destroyed. In some cases, they were never created in the first place. Staff turnover? Rarely logged? Injuries? Explained away or ignored entirely? Abuse. Buried under layers of bureaucratic silence. Children were frequently transferred between homes or into foster arrangements with no documentation following them. If a child disclosed abuse, the report, if it even made it to paper, was likely to disappear, found years later only by accident, if at all. In institutions run under religious orders, the veil of ecclesiastical authority often superseded any need to inform law enforcement. The result? A widespread culture of impunity. The independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, launched in the UK in 2014 and concluding its final report in 2022, picked through the ashes of this long-burning scandal. What it found was a pattern not of negligence, but of willful concealment. In testimonies heard by the inquiry's Truth Project, survivors recounted how they'd returned as adults to the homes that raised them, desperate for records that might help them reconnect with lost siblings or piece together their own timelines. More often than not, the documents were gone. Some were told the records had been destroyed in a fire, though no incident reports existed. Others were informed that files had been routinely purged to save space. Still others faced a sickening twist. Their abusers' names were scrubbed from records, while the children themselves were mislabeled as troubled, manipulative, or sexually precocious. Convenient language to shift the blame and silence the victim. It's impossible to calculate the psychological toll this took. For survivors, the destroyed or falsified records not only closed off their pasts, they closed off justice. With no documentation, legal cases collapsed. Police investigations stalled, and the institutions that perpetrated or enabled unspeakable harm shielded themselves behind a bureaucratic smokescreen. Denial became default. Liability dissipated in the fog. In some testimonies, older survivors recalled the moment they discovered even their names were not their own. Adopted into abusive foster homes under false pretenses, they had been told their birth families wanted nothing to do with them. Another lie made easier by the void of records. One survivor discovered, 40 years later, that his mother had spent a decade searching for him through official channels, only to be thwarted at every turn by red tape and stonewalling. There were those, of course, who knew. Staff members who saw bruises and said nothing. Administrators who ordered files shredded in overstuffed basements. Priests who moved, accused brothers across dioceses like chess pieces. Civil servants who clocked out each evening knowing those children would never come home. These were not isolated mistakes. They were part of a culture that treated vulnerable children as disposable cargo, and their truths as administrative inconveniences. Even today, the legacy remains. Thousands of survivors continue to seek answers through tribunals and searches. Many will never find them. Entire lifetimes have passed within shadows cast by documents that no longer exist, or perhaps never did. The silence, more than any single act, is what indicts the system most. Because silence doesn't just happen. It's built, brick by brick, file by file, lie by subtle, deliberate lie. And for the children lost in its echo, the silence was never empty. It was full of everything they were never allowed to say. The forgotten voices, survivors seeking justice. They were children. Small hands holding suitcases far too big for their frames. Names scribbled on tags hung from their necks, like parcels in transit. Promised sunshine and opportunity, they shattered on the shores of betrayal. More than 100,000 children were deported from Britain to former colonies like Australia and Canada between the late 19th century and 1970s. But when the last boat left, the silence began, until someone finally listened. In 1986, social worker Margaret Humphreys received a letter from a woman in Australia. The woman claimed she had been sent there from Britain as a child, alone, and had never seen her parents again. At first, Humphreys thought there must be some mix-up. How could a child be shipped overseas without consent, without trace? She soon discovered it wasn't just one child. It was thousands. Margaret Humphreys became the voice they had lost. With steely determination and a heart full of anguish, she unraveled the secret history of Britain's child migration schemes. Her quiet revolution began in Nottingham, but soon swept across continents. Working tirelessly, she founded the Child Migrants Trust, a small organization that would come to stand against a vast machinery of silence. In countless living rooms across Australia and the UK, she sat with survivors who carried memories like wounds. Some bore physical scars from beatings in Catholic-run institutions. Some flinched when describing the loneliness, the hunger, the aching absence of love. Others had blocked it all out, until a name on a letterhead pulled the past, screaming back into the present. "The memories are with me every day," said Gordon, sent to Australia when he was 8 years old. "I remember crying on the dock in Fremantle. I thought Mum would come get me. She never did. They'd told me she was dead. Only she wasn't." Like many other migrant children, Gordon had been lied to. Parents were told their children had been adopted. Children were told their parents were gone. In between, a chasm of deception. Through exhaustive research, emotional reunions, and battles through red tape, The Child Migrants Trust worked to reconnect families torn apart by a system that had prioritized empire over empathy, policy over person. With every case, Humphreys and her small team carried the burden of systemic betrayal, often at great personal cost. She was stalked, harassed, even received death threats. But still, she continued, because they needed her. In 1999, the British government launched a formal inquiry into the child migration programs. Survivors sat in hearing rooms, finally allowed to speak into record the horrors they had borne in silence for decades. One such testimony came from Arthur, who had been sent to a notorious institution in Western Australia. Choking back tears, he testified, "They stole my childhood, my family, my identity. What else was there to take?" Then came the apologies. In 2009, Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd stood in the Parliament House and spoke directly to the survivors. "We acknowledge the profound grief, suffering, and loss. We say sorry." His voice cracked on the final words. Survivors in the gallery wept openly. Some sobbed into handkerchiefs. Others stared, stone-faced, too shattered for tears. A few months later, in 2010, British Prime Minister Gordon Brown offered his own apology. In the House of Commons, he said, "To all those former child migrants, we are truly sorry. They were let down. We are sorry they were allowed to be sent away at all. We are sorry that the voices of these children were not always heard. We are sorry that it took so long for this important issue to be brought to light." Yet for many survivors, the words, though sincere, arrived too late. Some had died before ever hearing them. Some still wait for proper reparations. "An apology is a start," said Margaret Humphreys in response. "But justice must live in action, funding records access, providing psychological support, helping families reunite. That's the work. And so the trust continues." In a modest office with faded photos and overstuffed cabinets, their mission remains unchanged: to restore history stolen and to comfort the living testimonies of a buried injustice. For Margaret Humphreys, the fight was never just political, it was human. She once described meeting a woman in her 60s, holding a fragile letter from a long-lost mother. They had just discovered each other after 5 decades. Humphreys recalled, "This wasn't a case file. This was a life. A woman waiting 50 years to be told she was wanted." In the end, it wasn't about rewriting history. It was about finally writing it down in voices that had too long been ignored. These are the forgotten voices, now, at last, remembered. A nation's shame. Apology too late. Voiceover. On a cold February morning in 2010, history stumbled into Parliament. Cameras flashed, suits shifted in their seats, and across the United Kingdom, and half a world away, survivors waited, breathless, for words they were told would never come. Behind the lectern stood Prime Minister Gordon Brown. With solemn eyes and a voice heavy with the weight of a century, he looked into the nation's past and said, "To all those former child migrants, we are truly sorry. They were let down. We are sorry they were allowed to be sent away at the time, and that this happened. We are sorry that the voices of these children were not always heard, their cries for help unacknowledged. It was a moment decades in the making, achingly overdue. The British government was formally apologizing for one of its darkest, most shameful policies: child migration. For over 100 years, from the late 1800s into the 1970s, more than 130,000 British children, some as young as 3, were forcibly taken from their homes, orphanages, or single mothers, and shipped across oceans to Australia, Canada, Rhodesia, and New Zealand. York's and Liverpool's emptied. Fremantle and Perth waited silently to receive a tide of lost innocence. The scheme was sold as a mercy. Officials promised brighter futures, a life where these children could grow strong in a new world. But behind the propaganda was something far more sinister. They were cheap labor, currency for empire, and prey. Many of the children had living parents, single mothers tricked into signing papers they could barely read. Others were simply told their parents were dead. Lies neatly typed into social work files. Decades later, adult survivors would find out heartbreakingly that their mothers had spent their lives searching, sending letters never answered, waiting at ports that never brought them home. And on that day in 2010, as Brown delivered his softly worded atonement, the weight of all those years, of silence, of abandonment, collided in Parliament's ancient walls. But for many survivors, watching from afar, his words felt hollow, surreal, like reading your own obituary in a language you never learned. In Perth, Australia, 67-year-old Harold watched the broadcast alone in a care home. Born in Manchester, sent to Australia aged 8. In the audience, no celebratory champagne, just the flicker of a TV above a cracked window pane. He shook his head. Sorry. Sorry for what? He told reporters later. My childhood? Sorry doesn't give it back. Sorry won't take the belt from the priest's hand. Sorry doesn't dig up the unmarked graves of the others who never made it. Across the continent, other survivors gathered at Federation Square. Some wept. Some sat in silence. Scars, invisible but aching, beneath neat suits and graying hair. They remembered the day of their departure. Lined up, new coats, empty suitcases, promised pony rides and sunlit schools. Instead, many found themselves in brutal institutions like Bindoon and Fairbridge, run by organizations that claimed moral virtue but concealed physical torment. In Bindoon, the Christian Brothers forced children to build their own dormitories from stone. No gloves, no safety, just bleeding hands and breaking backs. Behind closed doors, priests beat them, raped them. For some, the trauma would spiral into lifelong addiction, broken marriages, suicide. And now, in 2010, the government apologized. But for whom? Eunice McCleary, 75, relocated from Glasgow to Australia when she was just 9, put it bluntly during a BBC interview. Where was this apology when my mother died? She begged them to give me back. They never replied to her letters. They let her die alone, thinking I'd abandoned her. Sorry doesn't fix that. Indeed, the apology came too late for most. Of the 130,000 children who had been sent away, tens of thousands had already died, never hearing a word of regret, never knowing the truth of why they were taken. Most spent their lives believing they were unloved, unwanted, forgotten. Ministers in Parliament called it a profound national shame. Yet many had long known. Whistleblowers shouted into voids for years. In 1998, a damning report by the Health Select Committee laid bare the horrors. Survivors gave testimony, ripping back the veil. There were documentaries, books, outcries. Still, it took until 2010 to hear the words every child hopes to hear. You were not at fault. Why so long? Perhaps the system feared what the truth would cost, the legal consequences, the reputational ruin. Or perhaps, as with many of Britain's darker imperial legacies, there was comfort in forgetfulness. But trauma does not forget. Apologies do not resurrect stolen childhoods, or parent-child reunions that could have happened but never did. They don't erase the knife edge of being 10 years old, whipped in a concrete dorm miles from anyone who used your name with kindness. Still, that February day in 2010 mattered. Because there is power in words, in record, in recognition. Truth has gravity. For Harold, for Eunice, for the thousands of survivors scattered across Australia and Canada like blown leaves, it meant something to finally be seen. But is it enough? Can a speech undo decades of broken lives? Can a government unwrite lies scrawled over birth certificates, or reunite the dead with the ones who waited? There are no easy answers. For some, the apology was balm, too late but still needed. For others, it only deepened the wound, a reminder that justice had been delayed, and in many ways, denied. Yet in the hearts of those children turned elders, one truth remained clear. They were not the forgotten ones. They were taken. They were victims of a plan crafted by suits in rooms of power, executed in silence, and left unspoken for too long. And now, at least, those in power had spoken, even if their words could never be enough. The children the empire left behind. They were called orphans, but many had parents. They were called rescued, but few were asked if they wanted to leave. They were sent far from the homes they knew, to Australia, to Canada, to Rhodesia, places they couldn't even point to on a map. Over 130,000 children taken from the streets, the workhouses, and the care homes of Britain. They vanished into the open arms of colonies eager for white settlers, into labor camps masquerading as farms, into institutions under smiling crosses where cane and belt ruled over compassion. This wasn't a secret. It wasn't a rogue plan unfolding in shadow. It was government policy, detailed, logged, and stamped by Whitehall, endorsed by the church, who called it charity, overseen by officials who called it child salvation. The British child migrant programs did not take place in some distant, barbaric past. The last forced child deportation happened as recently as 1970. Now pause and ask, what allows a nation to package up its most vulnerable and ship them across the world? What kind of system decides that a child's loneliness, trauma, or poverty can be solved not by care, but by distance? Empire was never just about land. It was about hierarchy. It was about deciding whose suffering mattered and whose did not. The British Empire, like all empires, was built on the assumption that some lives had more value than others. The child migration scheme was simply an extension of that belief, turned inward. Suddenly, the undesirable classes weren't inconvenient strangers overseas. They were inconvenient children at home. And so innocence became a commodity. The child became something to be staffed, relocated, utilized, made useful. The British government told a story, to itself, to the colonies, to history, that this was for the child's benefit, that they were offering brighter futures, filled with sunshine and farmland and discipline. But what was offered, in truth, was abandonment. Many of these children were beaten into obedience, starved for affection, punished without cause. Some were sexually abused by the very clergy meant to care for them, violated in God's name and then condemned to silence. No letters allowed, no calls home. Many were told their parents had died. They hadn't. Family life extinguished not by war or fate, but by bureaucracy. Empire demands a clean conscience, and so lies were required to make this palatable, to justify the institutional neglect as benevolence. And we should ask, how often today do we still disguise cruelty as kindness, because we like to believe we're past this, that we've evolved, that the mistakes of history couldn't happen again? But look closer. Across the world right now, tens of thousands of children are trafficked, sold, tricked, or taken. Refugees flee war zones only to be caged in camps. Foster care systems overflow with kids who disappear into the cracks. In some places, orphanages are run less as shelters and more as businesses. Strip away the language, change the uniforms, and the echoes are deafening. There are still governments today willing to turn a blind eye so long as someone else takes responsibility. There are still institutions, cloaked in faith or patriotism, willing to say, they're better off this way. And there are still children today who don't know they've been lied to, who don't know that documents were forged, families erased, their stories rewritten before they even had a chance to speak. The children the empire left behind, those who grew up confused, institutionalized, or broken, are not relics of the past. They are a mirror held up to the darkest parts of our social conscience. A reminder that bureaucracy can be just as violent as bullets when it's used to disappear the vulnerable. That kindness as policy means nothing without empathy and practice. What do we ignore because it's inconvenient to see? What systems operate in our name, quietly, legally, invisibly? And who is being lost right now while we convince ourselves that everything is under control? The children were called migrants, but they were never given a choice. They were listed as saved, but rarely felt safe. They were labeled burdens, then cargo, then lessons. But they were people. Small hands, wide eyes. Human beings with dreams shaped too early by deprivation and grief. The British Empire didn't collapse overnight. It eroded, stone by stone, secret by secret, apology by delayed apology. But even as the Union flags came down, the damage it did in hearts and homes persists. Empire may be history, but the mindset never fully left. The belief in managing suffering from a distance, from the top down. That cruelty can be washed clean if it's done politely, or with good intentions. We owe them more than remembrance. We owe them vigilance, to look twice, to ask deeper questions, to notice when innocence is being rebranded as opportunity, yet again. Because if governments and churches could so easily collude to take children from their homes, lie to their families, and erase their pasts, then the most chilling question echoes louder than ever. What are we still blind to right now?